Welcome, and in today's video you won't believe what this HOA tried to pull, or how it all came crashing down. Let's go. The morning sun, usually a welcome visitor in Sarah's kitchen, felt like an accusation. It streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, and beyond them, the towering limbs of the century-old oak tree that dominated their front yard. For years, that tree had been a silent guardian, its broad canopy a comforting presence, its rustling leaves a natural lullaby on summer nights. But today, it was a battleground. Its roots, thick as a man's thigh, were slowly but surely pushing up the aging concrete of the sidewalk that crisscrossed their property. Not just a crack, mind you, but a distinct bulge, a minor mountain range in the flat expanse of their suburban pathway. And that, according to the ever-vigilant Greenleaf Estates Homeowners Association, was a monumental problem. Sarah's husband, Mark, sat across from her at the old pine table, a half-eaten piece of toast forgotten in front of him. His expression was a familiar mix of frustration and weary resignation. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, leaving white streaks of toast crumbs in its wake. "Another letter," he grumbled, pushing a crisp white envelope across the table. It was the third in as many weeks, each one more sharply worded than the last, its tone escalating from polite notice to thinly veiled threat. The official HOA seal, embossed in a rather aggressive shade of gold, seemed to mock them from the corner. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. She didn't even need to open it. She knew the drill. The letters always followed a predictable pattern. First, the standard boilerplate about maintaining community standards. Then, a specific reference to the hazardous sidewalk displacement caused by unmanaged arboreal growth. And finally, the punitive clause. A fine escalating with each passing day until the infraction was remedied. The initial fine had been $100. The last one had jumped to $500. What would this one be? 1,000? 2,000? Their savings, already stretched thin by 2 growing children and rising utility bills, couldn't take much more. Mark sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to carry the weight of all their financial anxieties. "They're demanding we remove the tree." His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly would make them irrevocably true. Sarah felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Remove the tree? It was unthinkable. That oak tree wasn't just a shade provider or a pretty backdrop. It was part of their history. When they bought the house 15 years ago, fresh-faced and optimistic, the realtor had pointed to it with a flourish, calling it the heart of the property. Their daughter, Lily, had learned to climb its lowest branches, her giggles echoing through the neighborhood. Their son, Sam, had spent countless hours beneath its sprawling canopy, building forts from discarded blankets and dreaming of distant galaxies. It was more than wood and leaves. It was a silent witness to their lives, a living monument to their family's journey. And then there was the practical side. The tree provided essential shade, especially during the sweltering Greenleaf Estates summers. Without it, their air conditioning bill would skyrocket. Their once reasonable energy costs would become astronomical. More importantly, removing a tree of that size wasn't just a matter of hacking at it with an axe. It required professional arborists, heavy equipment, and permits. That meant thousands of dollars, money they simply didn't have to spare. "We can't," Sarah said, her voice firmer this time. "We can't just cut it down. It's magnificent. And it'll cost a fortune." Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on the offending letter. "I know. I tried explaining that to Mrs. Davenport." Again. Mrs. Davenport was the HOA president, a woman whose perfectly coiffed blonde hair and impeccably pressed blouses belied a ruthless, unyielding nature. She saw the world in black and white, rules and infractions, with no room for nuance or empathy. Their prior interactions had been brief, one-sided affairs where Mrs. Davenport recited HOA bylaws like sacred scripture, and Mark attempted to inject a sliver of common sense into the conversation, always to no avail. "What did she say this time?" Sarah asked, dreading the answer. She said, "She said that rules are rules, Mr. Jenkins. Your personal sentimentality does not supersede community regulations regarding safety and property values." And then she cited some obscure clause about imminent hazard due to root intrusion. Mark mimicked Mrs. Davenport's clipped, superior tone, making a face that was almost comical if the situation weren't so dire. She also mentioned that if we didn't comply, they'd hire their own contractors and bill us for it. Plus, an additional penalty for noncompliance. Sarah felt a wave of indignation wash over her. "They can't do that, can they? Just unilaterally decide to chop down our tree." The thought made her blood run cold. The idea of strangers coming onto their property, wielding chainsaws against their beloved oak, felt like a personal violation. It felt like an attack on their very home. Mark shrugged, a gesture of helplessness. "According to this, they can. It's in the covenants. Section 4, subsection B, page 17, maintenance and modifications of exterior elements." She had it bookmarked, of course. He tossed the letter onto the table as if it were a venomous snake. The official, almost clinical language of the document stood in stark contrast to the emotional turmoil it caused. It talked about harmonious aesthetic standards and preserving the uniformity of the community. But to Sarah, it felt like an arbitrary exercise of power, a bureaucratic boot stamping on their family's cherished memories. But what about trimming, or a root barrier? Sarah's mind raced, trying to find an alternative, a loophole, anything to escape the dismal fate Mrs. Davenport had mapped out for them. She remembered reading an article once about specialized methods to manage tree roots without harming the tree itself. Surely, that was a more reasonable approach. "I suggested it," Mark said. "I even told her I pay for a professional arborist to assess it, to give an official report. You know, a diagnosis, a path forward. I explicitly said we'd look into methods to mitigate the sidewalk issue without removing the tree. I even offered to share the cost of repairing the sidewalk if the arborist confirmed it was the tree's fault, and that mitigation was possible." He'd presented it as a win-win, a compromise that would satisfy the HOA's safety concerns while preserving their valuable tree. He thought he was being reasonable. He thought he was offering a solution. A bitter laugh escaped him. "She just looked at me with that blank stare like I was speaking a foreign language. She said, and I quote, 'Mr. Jenkins, the time for assessments is over. The fact of the matter is the tree is causing damage. The only acceptable resolution, as per HOA guidelines, is its removal. Any attempt to modify or delay this resolution will be met with the full force of community protocols.'" It was like talking to a brick wall, a really well-dressed, condescending brick wall. Sarah closed her eyes, picturing the formidable Mrs. Davenport. She'd seen her often enough at community meetings, always seated at the head of the table, her voice ringing with undisputed authority. Mrs. Davenport had been the architect of several controversial HOA policies, including the notorious mandate that all mailboxes must be painted precisely the same shade of community-approved beige, a rule that had caused a minor rebellion among some of the more artistic residents. Mrs. Davenport saw the world, and indeed, entire neighborhoods, as something to be meticulously controlled, perfectly manicured, and utterly devoid of anything resembling individuality or natural irregularity. The oak tree, with its wild, untamed growth, its ancient presence, was an affront to her vision of suburban perfection. The silence that fell between them was heavy, filled with unspoken anxieties. What would they do? How could they fight an organization with seemingly unlimited power and deep pockets? The thought of legal action was terrifying. The fees alone would bankrupt them. Yet, the thought of losing the tree, of surrendering to what felt like an unjust and arbitrary demand, was equally unbearable. It wasn't just about the tree anymore. It was about their autonomy, their right to make decisions about their own property, their quiet rebellion against a system that seemed intent on eradicating anything that didn't fit its narrow definition of order. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "I'm not giving up," he said, his jaw set. "There has to be another way. They can't just walk all over us like this." He picked up the letter again, his fingers tracing the sharp, official font of Mrs. Davenport's signature. A spark, small but distinct, seemed to ignite behind his eyes. It was a spark Sarah recognized, a glint of the stubborn, inventive spirit that had first drawn her to him. A spirit that, when pushed too far, could become quite formidable. What would Mrs. Davenport do when she encountered a force as unyielding as her own, but one rooted in a defense of home, rather than bureaucratic control? The answer to that question, Sarah realized, would determine far more than just the fate of an old oak tree. The next few days crawled by, each tick of the clock feeling like a countdown to doom. Mark spent every spare moment hunched over his laptop, the blue glow illuminating his face in the dim living room, as he delved into the murky waters of HOA bylaws, property laws, and environmental protection statutes. Their kitchen table, once a hub of family meals and homework sessions, was now buried under a mountain of legal documents, printed emails, and highlighted regulations. He even unearthed the original Greenleaf Estates Developers Agreement, a thick, yellow tome that smelled faintly of mildew and forgotten dreams. Sarah watched him, a mix of admiration and growing concern in her heart. He was relentless, driven by a quiet fury she rarely saw, a protective instinct that flared brightly when his family or home was threatened. But against the monolithic structure of the HOA, it felt like he was wielding a fly swatter against a dragon. He called arborists, not just for quotes on removal but for opinions on preservation. Each one confirmed his initial suspicion. The tree, while old, was fundamentally healthy. Its roots were indeed robust, but not diseased or aggressively destructive in an unusual way. They were simply doing what ancient tree roots do, spreading, strengthening, seeking purchase. A few suggested root barriers, deep trenches lined with specialized material to redirect growth away from the sidewalk. Others proposed raising the sidewalk in a gentle hump over the roots, a more aesthetically pleasing and less damaging alternative to wholesale removal. One arborist, a wise old man with hands like gnarled oak branches, even spoke of a concept called structural root pruning, a delicate surgical procedure that could trim offending roots without compromising the tree's stability. It all sounded promising, a legitimate path forward. Mark meticulously documented each conversation, each suggestion. He compiled a portfolio of potential solutions, complete with estimated costs and timelines, all of which were significantly lower than the expense of total removal. He even included before and after photographs of other properties where similar root issues had been successfully mitigated without felling the tree. He crafted an eloquent, reasoned argument, citing precedents and offering compromises. He was ready for a proper negotiation. He was ready to prove that he was not an adversary but a resident committed to finding a sensible solution. Then came the email, not from Mrs. Davenport directly, but from the HOA's administrative assistant, a terse, one-line response to Mark's request for a formal meeting to present his findings. The HOA board's decision regarding the oak tree at 142 Sycamore Lane is final. Further discussion is unproductive. Expect official action if compliance is not observed by the stated deadline. There was no room for dialogue, no invitation for compromise, just a stone wall of bureaucratic indifference. It felt like a punch to the gut. All that effort, all those hours, all that hope, dismissed with a single dismissive sentence. Sarah watched as Mark read the email, his shoulders slumping, the fight slowly draining from his eyes. He looked up, his face pale, a flicker of despair in his gaze. "They won't even talk to me," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. They want it gone, no matter what." The frustration became a dull ache, then a burning resentment. It wasn't about the rules anymore. It was about power. Mrs. Davenport, with her ironclad grip on the HOA board, clearly saw the refusal to remove the tree as an act of defiance, a challenge to her authority. This wasn't about a sidewalk. It was a power play, a demonstration of who truly held the reins in Greenleaf Estates. By refusing compromise, she was sending a clear message: comply or be crushed. And the tree, their beautiful, innocent tree, was caught in the crossfire. That evening, a heavy silence hung over dinner. Lily, usually bubbling with stories from school, picked at her pasta. Sam, too immersed in his space adventures to notice much, sensed the tension radiating from his parents. Sarah's appetite had vanished days ago. The thought of the looming deadline, the threat of strangers with chainsaws descending upon their home, made her stomach churn. Mark pushed his plate away, the food untouched. He looked out the window, his gaze fixed on the shadowy silhouette of the oak tree against the twilight sky. Its branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, a silent lament. I don't understand," he said, his voice raspy. Why be so unreasonable? This isn't a matter of life or death. It's a tree, a beautiful, old tree. Why can't they just let us find a way to fix the sidewalk and keep the tree?" Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His skin was cold. "It's not about the tree to them, Mark. It's about control." He turned, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time in days the despair seemed to lift, replaced by something sharper, something more dangerous. "Then let's give them control," he said, a strange light entering his eyes. "Let's give them control over a situation they never anticipated. Let's comply, but not in the way they expect." Sarah frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" A slow, almost imperceptible smile began to spread across Mark's face, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but hinted at a deep, simmering resolve. "They demanded an arborist report, didn't they? They just dismissed the idea of assessment, but they never explicitly said no to an arborist actually working on the tree, did they?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a conspiratorial tone that made goosebumps prickle on Sarah's arms. "They said the tree needed to be managed. They said it was causing damage. They said it needed resolution. Well, I'm going to resolve it, but on my terms, not theirs." He spent the rest of the evening making calls, but these calls were different. There was no more pleading, no more negotiation. His voice was calm, almost detached, but beneath the surface, Sarah could sense a steel resolve she hadn't heard before. He called the arborist he'd spoken to earlier, the one who had mentioned structural root pruning. He didn't ask for an assessment this time. He asked for a quote, a definitive, no-nonsense quote for mitigating the impact of the roots on the sidewalk, while preserving the tree's structural integrity and health. He also asked for something else, something Sarah couldn't quite make out through the low murmur of his voice. But there was a definite shift in his posture, a renewed sense of purpose that hadn't been there moments before. The next morning, the spark in Mark's eyes had become a small, controlled flame. He was unusually quiet at breakfast, but his movements were deliberate, precise. He ate every bite of his toast, something he hadn't done in days. When he pushed his plate away, he looked at Sarah, a mischievous glint in his pupils. "I've found our arborist," he announced. "He's brilliant, truly a craftsman, and he understands the nuances of the situation." "Nuances?" Sarah asked, intrigued despite herself. "What nuances?" Mark just smiled, a knowing smile that gave nothing away. "Let's just say he's a creative problem solver. He appreciates challenges." He rose from the table, grabbed his car keys, and headed for the door. "I'll be back a bit later. I have a meeting." "A meeting with whom?" Sarah called after him. But he was already out the door, the screen door slapping shut behind him. Later that day, a large, commercial arborist truck rumbled down Sycamore Lane, its imposing presence turning heads. It was emblazoned with the logo Nature's Sculptors, Artistry in Arboriculture. Sarah watched from the window as a man, tall and broad-shouldered with a kindly face framed by a wild, graying beard, stepped out of the truck. He wore a heavy-duty work vest and carried a clipboard with a professional air. Mark met him by the majestic oak. The two men stood for a long time, looking up at the tree, then down at the offending sidewalk, then back at the tree. They gestured, they pointed. They seemed to be engaged in a deeply serious, almost philosophical discussion about the grand old oak. Then, the arborist pulled out a tape measure. He began to measure the tree, not just its trunk or its canopy spread, but its individual branches, its overall height, its circumference at various points. He made notes, drew diagrams. He spent an exceptionally long time pacing the perimeter of the front yard, occasionally stopping to look across the street, directly at Mrs. Davenport's immaculate, yet soulless, beige house. Specifically, he kept looking at her large, unobstructed kitchen window. A strange feeling began to bloom in Sarah's chest, a mix of trepidation and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Mark was up to something. And whatever it was going to be big. The calm, almost serene expression on his face as he watched the arborist work spoke volumes. He wasn't negotiating anymore. He was planning, and Mrs. Davenport had absolutely no idea what was coming. The deadline loomed, yes, but Mark had a plan to meet it, a dazzling, unexpected kind of compliance that would leave the HOA reeling. The following morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect canvas for what was about to unfold. Sarah awoke to the distant rumble of heavy machinery, a sound that usually triggered a wave of anxiety, but today infused her with a strange, almost nervous anticipation. She crept to the kitchen window, her heart thumping, and saw it. A colossal crane, its long neck extended skyward like some prehistoric bird, parked strategically at the very edge of their driveway. Two professional arborists, wearing safety harnesses and looking remarkably agile for their size, were already scaling the mighty oak, their movements fluid and practiced. The man with the wild, graying beard, the chief arborist Mark had hired, stood on the sidewalk below, clipboard in hand, issuing instructions through a headset. Mark was there too, standing a little distance away, a cup of coffee in his hand. He wasn't directing, just observing, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He looked entirely too calm for a man whose ancient tree was about to undergo a radical transformation. Sarah watched him, a million questions swirling in her mind, but she held them back. This was Mark's show. This was his answer to Mrs. Davenport, and she had a feeling it was going to be spectacular. Suddenly, a curtain twitched across the street. Mrs. Davenport's kitchen window, the very one the arborist had studied so intently, was now a perfect frame for her disapproving face. She was clearly an early riser, and the cacophony of the crane and the sight of men rappelling down her neighbor's tree had jolted her from her suburban slumber. Sarah could practically feel the waves of indignation radiating from across the street. Mrs. Davenport, ever the stickler for rules and order, must have assumed this was the long-awaited tree removal. But even from this distance, through the half-closed blinds, Sarah could sense a growing unease in Mrs. Davenport's expression, a dawning realization that something was not quite right, that this wasn't the standard tree felling she had anticipated. The arborist, guided by Mark, had clearly chosen his angles. The crane's boom was positioned in such a way that the top of the oak, which was about to be the focus of the operation, was directly framed by Mrs. Davenport's window. It was a subtle, yet undeniably deliberate choice. Every cut, every maneuver would be in her direct line of sight. The work began with a precision that was almost surgical. Chainsaws hummed to life, not with the aggressive roar of felling, but with a controlled, almost artistic whine. The arborists moved with incredible dexterity, traversing the canopy, identifying specific branches and making precise cuts. They weren't simply lopping off limbs, they were shaping, sculpting. Large branches, ones that had previously stretched over the sidewalk and encroached on their neighbor's property, were carefully lowered to the ground by ropes and pulleys, section by section. This was not a brutal hack job. It was a delicate dance between man and nature. Sarah watched, mesmerized. She still didn't fully grasp Mark's grand plan, but the sheer meticulousness of the work was captivating. The arborist supervising on the ground would occasionally step back, squinting at the tree, then point emphatically, guiding his team with an artist's vision. He was clearly not just a tree trimmer. He was a landscape architect working with living material. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting the oak in a golden glow. The air filled with the scent of fresh-cut wood and the rhythmic hum of equipment. Neighbors, drawn by the unusual activity, began to emerge from their homes, some with coffee cups in hand, others with children clinging to their legs. Whispers rippled through the curious crowd. What are they doing? Are they actually cutting it down? It looks different. Indeed it did. As the morning wore on, the tree began to shed its old form, revealing a new, startling silhouette. The dense, sprawling canopy that had once spread wide and untamed was being carefully pruned, thinned, and brought into sharp, deliberate lines. It was a transformation, not a destruction. The arborists seemed to be carving out negative space, creating windows through the leaves, emphasizing specific branch structures that had long been hidden beneath a thick cloak of foliage. By mid-afternoon, the tree was barely recognizable. It was no longer a wild, organic presence. It was something else entirely. The lower branches had been lifted, creating a clear, unobstructed path beneath. The upper canopy had been meticulously shaped, not into a generic dome, but into a series of distinct, almost architectural layers. The portions of the tree that had been directly above the offending sidewalk were now dramatically reduced, yet the tree as a whole remained robust, its main trunk and primary limbs untouched. It was still undeniably a grand oak, but it had been reinvented. Mark finally walked over to Sarah, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "What do you think?" he asked, gesturing proudly at the undergoing masterpiece. Sarah stared. The word that immediately sprang to mind was trimmed or pruned. It was sculpted. The tree, which had once been expansive and round, was now narrower, taller, its branches forming a series of concentric, almost spiral-like forms ascending towards the sky. It reminded her of something, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It's incredible, Mark," she breathed, genuinely astonished. "But what is it? What did you tell them to do?" Mark's smile widened, a true, unrestrained grin this time. "I told them to give Greenleaf Estates exactly what they asked for. I told them to manage the tree, and to make it a statement piece, something unforgettable." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I told them to turn it into a living sculpture, a giant, natural obelisk, and I specifically requested that it be exactly 12 feet tall from the highest point of the sidewalk to its apex." Sarah's eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. 12 feet. Why 12 feet? Then she remembered the exact phrasing from the HOA rulebook about maximum height for hedges and ornamental trees in front yard setbacks, usually limited to 10 feet. But this wasn't a hedge. This was clearly an art piece. And the exact height of it, a foot, maybe 2, above the standard regulation, but still below the maximum for certain specimen trees, was deliberate. It was just enough to be noticeable, just enough to be slightly irregular without being overtly defiant. The shape, almost pyramidal now, was striking. And the height. It perfectly ensured that its newly sculpted crown would be visible from Mrs. Davenport's kitchen window, framing her pristine view with an undeniable, unignorable presence, not blocking it but becoming a part of it. Across the street, Mrs. Davenport's curtain twitched again, more violently this time. Sarah could almost hear the gears turning in the HOA president's mind, the frantic searching through the rulebook for a clause, any clause, that could address this utterly unanticipated outcome. Mark hadn't defied the rules. He had twisted them, contorted them, transformed them into something entirely new. He hadn't removed the damaging roots, but he had removed other growth to balance the overall impact. He hadn't cut off a limb, but he had elevated it. He hadn't destroyed the tree. He had elevated its status to an art installation, making it impervious to the general maintenance clauses. This wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of extreme calculated compliance, a masterclass in passive aggression. And the sheer audacity of it, the quiet, meticulous revenge, sent a shiver of delight down Sarah's spine. The tree was still there. More than that, it was a magnificent, unmissable monument to Mark's ingenuity and Mrs. Davenport's utter, impotent fury. The real battle, Sarah knew, was just beginning, and they had just fired the most beautiful opening salvo. The newly sculpted oak, now a majestic, albeit peculiar, 12-foot-tall natural monument, immediately became the talk of Greenleaf Estates. It was impossible to ignore. Its clean, upward-sweeping lines, contrasted with the dense, manicured hedges of its neighbors, made it stand out like a proud, green sentinel. People drove slower as they passed the Jenkins house, craning their necks, whispering, pointing. Some admired its artistic flair, marveling at the arborist's skill. Others, particularly those more aligned with Mrs. Davenport's rigid vision of suburban perfection, simply shook their heads, bewildered by this sudden, inexplicable breach of aesthetic uniformity. They didn't know what to make of it. It was clearly a tree, still rooted, still alive, yet it bore no resemblance to any other tree in the manicured neighborhood. Mark and Sarah, meanwhile, felt a renewed sense of peace in their home, a quiet triumph that settled over them like the comforting shade of their now elevated arboreal artwork. They still had to repair the sidewalk, of course, but the immediate threat of tree removal had vanished. The arborist had confirmed that by raising the crown and carefully airspading around the base, the existing roots would no longer exert upward pressure on the sidewalk. They were still underground, yes, a testament to the tree's enduring life, but their damaging effect had been strategically neutralized. Mark had even managed to get a signed letter from the arborist detailing the mitigation techniques used, proudly declaring the tree now a managed, structurally sound, and aesthetically unique specimen. This document, a shield against any further HOA accusations, sat prominently on their kitchen counter, a silent testament to their strategic victory. They had complied technically, beautifully, infuriatingly. Mrs. Davenport, however, was clearly not enjoying this new piece of art. Sarah often saw her through the kitchen window, her face a mask of barely contained fury, her hand often gripping the curtain as if she wanted to rip it from its rod. The new tree was a constant, glaring reminder of Mark's audacious maneuver. It framed her view of the street, a stark, vertical challenge to her horizontal sense of order. She couldn't look out without seeing it. She couldn't escape its silent, green judgment. The initial response from the HOA was a predictable flurry of emails. Not the usual dry, administrative messages, but agitated, almost desperate inquiries. "What exactly have you done to the tree?" one read. "This unusual modification of an existing landscape feature requires prior board approval. Please cease all work immediately," Mark calmly replied, citing the prior correspondence where the HOA had demanded the tree be managed and the issue resolved. He attached the arborist's report, highlighting the sections that explained how the tree had been pruned for structural integrity and how its root impact had been addressed. He even mentioned that the arborist had ensured the tree's health was prioritized. He had complied. They had asked for a resolution, and he had given them one, albeit a very *specific *1. The HOA board, a collection of Mrs. Davenport's loyalists and a few well-meaning but easily swayed residents, was thrown into utter disarray. They called an emergency meeting, of course. Mark and Sarah received the summons via a hastily hand-delivered, rather crinkled notice, indicating the urgency. The agenda: unprecedented landscape alteration at 142 Sycamore Lane. Implications for community standards. The meeting room, usually sparsely attended, was packed. Whispers filled the air as Mark and Sarah walked in, a collective gaze following them. Mrs. Davenport, seated at the head of the table, her usual air of cool authority slightly frayed around the edges, glared at them as they took their seats. Her mouth was a thin, unyielding line. She looked like someone who had eaten a particularly sour lemon and was still wrestling with the aftertaste. When it was their turn to speak, Mark, calm and articulate, presented his case. He reiterated his initial attempts at compromise, the ignored arborist reports, the HOA's unwavering demand for resolution. Then, with a flourish, he presented the current arborist report, emphasizing its findings. "We were told the tree was an issue," he stated, his voice even. "We were told it needed to be managed. We hired the most reputable arborist in the county to do exactly that. Not only have we mitigated the sidewalk issue, but we've also maintained the tree's health and significantly enhanced the aesthetic value of our property, turning an old oak into a unique living art piece." He looked directly at Mrs. Davenport, a challenge in his eyes. "We followed your instructions. We resolved the problem." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Some residents exchanged glances, a few even nodding in agreement. They couldn't deny his logic. He had acted within the spirit of the complaint, even if the outcome was utterly unforeseen. Mrs. Davenport, however, was fuming. Her face, a familiar shade of florid pink, tightened. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice strained, "this is not what we meant by management. This obelisk asterisk is not in keeping with the harmonious aesthetic of Greenleaf Estates. It's an eyesore. It stands out like a sore thumb." "An eyesore, Mrs. Davenport," Mark replied, his tone polite, almost innocent. "I believe the arborist's report clearly states it's a unique, aesthetically enhanced specimen. Many of our neighbors seem to appreciate its artistic merit. Besides," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "where in the HOA covenants does it specify the exact shape or artistic style of a tree on private property, so long as it is healthy and not causing damage?" He paused, allowing his question to hang in the air, unanswered. "You wanted it managed. It is managed. It is healthy. It no longer threatens the sidewalk. We complied with the guidelines you set forth." He had her, and she knew it. The rules, as written, were about functionality and damage, not artistic interpretation. There was no clause about too artistic or too unique. Her argument about aesthetics was subjective, and Mark had neatly sidestepped the practical concerns of the roots. Mrs. Davenport stammered, searching for a rebuttal, her eyes darting between Mark and the thick HOA rulebook in front of her. She furiously flipped through pages, her brow furrowed in concentration, desperate to find a loophole, a hidden clause that would allow her to condemn this rebellious vegetation. But there was nothing. The rules specified height, proximity to structures, maintenance for health, but nothing, absolutely nothing about artistic trimming. No mention of a standard tree shape. Another board member, Mr. Henderson, a retired lawyer who usually remained silent, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Davenport, Mr. Jenkins has presented a compelling argument. He sought professional consultation, rectified the hazard, and maintained the tree's vitality. The covenants are clear regarding maintenance. They do not, however, regulate artistic expression in landscape design, so long as it doesn't violate specific height or setback rules, which Mr. Jenkins appears to have adhered to. He looked pointedly at the 12-foot height, a knowing glint in his eye. That height, while unusual for a pruned tree, was just shy of what could be considered an oversized structure, and clearly fell within the realm of a healthy, if ambitious, tree. Mrs. Davenport's face reddened further. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came out. She was trapped in her own labyrinth of rules. Mark had used her own weapon against her, wielded the very bylaws she cherished, and turned them into a blunt instrument of artistic rebellion. The meeting adjourned with no clear resolution from the HOA, a rare occurrence. Mrs. Davenport, defeated for the moment but clearly not giving up, merely stated that the board would review the matter further. But the message was clear. For now, the obelisk tree stood. Mark and Sarah walked out, a quiet sense of triumph in their stride, the whispers of the neighbors now tinged with admiration and grudging respect. They hadn't won the war, not yet, but they had certainly won a significant battle. And the fact that Mrs. Davenport had to stare at their triumph every single day, right from her kitchen window, made the victory all the sweeter. The next move, they knew, would be hers, and whatever it would be born of deep personal fury. The quiet storm was brewing. The quiet satisfaction that settled over Mark and Sarah didn't last long. Mrs. Davenport, though temporarily thwarted, was not one to accept defeat. The sight of the obelisk tree, a daily reminder of her perceived humiliation and Mark's audacious defiance, festered within her like a poison. Sarah imagined her seething over her morning coffee, the pristine white walls of her kitchen reflecting the defiant, artful silhouette across the street. Mrs. Davenport was a creature of order, of absolute control, and this unexpected deviation was an intolerable stain on her carefully curated community. The retaliation came swiftly, not as a direct attack on the tree itself, but as a systematic campaign of harassment, designed to chip away at their resolve and make their lives in Greenleaf Estates unbearable. It began subtly, with an anonymous phone call to the County Code Enforcement Office, complaining about unapproved landscaping modifications and potential violations of scenic easements. Mark received a terse notice, demanding plans for the tree's unusual modifications. He simply submitted the arborist's report and a polite letter explaining the previous HOA interaction, and the complaint was quickly dismissed. Code enforcement had no provisions for regulating tree shape, only health and safety. Then came the petty infractions. A notice, tucked under their doormat one morning, cited them for improper placement of recycling bins, a complaint so trivial it bordered on absurd. Their bins were, as always, placed neatly at the curb on collection day. The next week, it was a warning about excessive lawn growth in violation of Community Standard 7.3, despite Mark having mowed only 3 days prior. The fines, small at first, began to accumulate, a steady drip designed to wear them down financially and emotionally. Each fine was accompanied by a stern, legally formatted letter, almost identical to the ones Mrs. Davenport had used for the tree, only this time the infraction was laughably minor. "This is ridiculous," Sarah fumed one evening, holding up a notice for unapproved placement of garden gnomes. They didn't even own garden gnomes. She looked at Mark wide-eyed. "They're just making things up now." Mark, though visibly frustrated, remained eerily calm. He methodically documented each notice, taking photographs, writing detailed rebuttals, meticulously building a case. He learned to distinguish Mrs. Davenport's influence from legitimate HOA issues. Every notice that seemed disproportionate to the crime, or vaguely worded, he treated as an extension of her personal vendetta. He understood the game. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about intimidation. The HOA newsletters, previously bland chronicles of community events and maintenance schedules, began to subtly shift in tone. Articles about maintaining community cohesion and upholding the integrity of design appeared, peppered with veiled references to individual residents who disrupt the carefully established harmony. While no names were mentioned, the context was unmistakable. Gossip, expertly sown by Mrs. Davenport's inner circle, began to spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Whispers about problem residents and those difficult Jenkins followed Mark and Sarah through the grocery store aisles and at school pickups. Friends, once warm and welcoming, began to avoid their eye contact, their smiles becoming strained. Mrs. Davenport's campaign wasn't just administrative, it was social. She was attempting to isolate them, to make them pariahs in their own community. One particularly galling incident involved their children. Lily, always a sensitive child, came home from school one day visibly upset. "Mommy," she sniffled, tears welling in her eyes, "Samantha's mom told her she can't come play at our house anymore. She said our tree was ugly and that our family was causing trouble for Mrs. Davenport." Sarah's heart ached. The thought of their children bearing the brunt of this absurd feud was almost unbearable. They had tried to shield Lily and Sam from the adult animosity, but Mrs. Davenport's reach seemed to extend even into the innocent world of childhood friendships. Mark, overhearing Lily's tearful confession, felt a new wave of anger wash over him, colder and more potent than before. This wasn't just about property or power anymore. It was about their family's well-being. This was crossing a line. His jaw tightened. He knew instinctively that this level of petty harassment could not go on forever. It would either break them or force them to escalate. And Mark Jenkins, with his stubborn streak and quiet capacity for ingenious countermeasures, was not about to break. He began spending even more time in his home office, not just researching bylaws, but meticulously reviewing the HOA budget, the minutes from past meetings, the public ones at least, and the legal structure of the Greenleaf Estates HOA itself. He was looking for weaknesses, for vulnerabilities, for the proverbial chink in Mrs. Davenport's armor. He knew, deep down, that such absolute power, especially when wielded for personal vendettas, often had inherent flaws. No system, especially one run by an autocratic figure, was perfectly impenetrable. One evening, after the children were asleep, Mark emerged from his office, a strange glint in his eye. He held a stack of papers, old meeting minutes, financial statements, and a copy of the HOA's most recent tax filings, which he had obtained through a public records request. "Sarah," he said, his voice unusually quiet, almost contemplative, "I think I found it." Sarah looked up from the book she was pretending to read, her heart quickening. "Found what?" He spread the papers out on the coffee table, carefully smoothing them. "Mrs. Davenport has been making a lot of decisions lately without full board approval. Or at least without proper documentation of full board approval. And some of these expenditures," he trailed off, his finger tracing a line on a financial statement, "they seem questionable. Significant sums spent on community beautification that nobody has seen. Preferential contracts awarded to certain landscaping or painting companies that happen to be owned by or employ close relatives of certain board members." Sarah leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "Are you saying—" Mark nodded slowly. "I'm saying this isn't just about our tree anymore. It's about a pattern of behavior, a pattern of, let's call it, fiscal indiscretion and potentially a complete disregard for due process. These arbitrary fines, the fabricated infractions, the social isolation, it's all part of a larger pattern of abuse of power." He tapped a specific line item on a budget report. "Look at this. A 5-figure sum for emergency sprinkler system repair last winter, But the community sprinklers are run by the city, not the HOA, and there was no such emergency. A new kind of determination dawned on Sarah's face. This wasn't petty squabbling. This was serious. This gave them leverage, not just against the harassment, but against the very foundation of Mrs. Davenport's reign. Mark had found a way to turn the tables, not by challenging Mrs. Davenport's rules, but by challenging her very right to enforce them. They had defended their aesthetic. Now they would defend their financial integrity, and by extension, the integrity of the entire community. The obelisk tree, a symbol of their initial defiance, now served as a beacon, drawing attention to the deeper rot beneath the polished facade of Greenleaf Estates. The war was escalating, and this time, Mark wasn't just defending. He was preparing to attack, not with chainsaws, but with facts, figures, and an unyielding commitment to justice. The quiet town of Greenleaf Estates was about to learn that beneath Mark Jenkins' mild exterior lay a strategic mind determined to see fairness prevail, no matter the personal cost. And Mrs. Davenport had played right into his hands. The revelation about the HOA's questionable financial practices ignited a new fire in Mark and Sarah. It wasn't just about their tree anymore, or the petty harassment. It had widened into a moral imperative, a fight for transparency and accountability within their community. This was no longer a personal vendetta, it was a matter of principle. Mark meticulously, almost obsessively, compiled his evidence. He gathered bank statements, cross-referenced vague invoices with HOA meeting minutes, and even looked through public contractor licenses to identify connections between vendors and board members. The picture that emerged was more disturbing than he had initially imagined. There were multiple instances of inflated invoices for minor repairs, services paid for but never visibly rendered, and suspiciously high consulting fees paid to companies with tenuous ties to Greenleaf Estates. He uncovered a pattern of emergency repairs that conveniently bypassed the standard bidding process, always favoring the same group of contractors. The significant sum for a sprinkler system repair, for a city-run system, was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. He discovered a 5-figure payment for security system upgrades that seemed entirely fictional. There was a consistent, low hum of small illegalities hidden under the guise of community improvements, all funneling money perhaps into unapproved projects or, worse yet, into personal pockets. The deeper Mark delved, the more infuriated he became. This wasn't sloppy accounting. It was a deliberate, systematic exploitation of unsuspecting homeowners. Each of the arbitrary fines they had received, each veiled threat and insinuation, now felt even more galling, as if Mrs. Davenport was projecting her own disregard for rules onto them. The sheer hypocrisy was breathtaking. Sarah, though less versed in financial forensics, worked alongside him, organizing documents, proofreading his meticulously crafted summaries, and offering emotional support. She saw how much this was consuming him, but also how vital it was. "Mark," she said one evening, finding him hunched over a spreadsheet at 2 a.m., his face pale in the glow of the monitor, "are you sure about this? This is big. It's not just a tree anymore. This could be legal trouble for them, for you." "I'm sure, Sarah," he replied, his voice firm, his eyes fixed on the numbers. "The evidence is here, plain as day, and if I don't do this, who will?" How many other families have been quietly swindled, intimidated, or pushed around by this kind of abuse of power? This goes beyond us. It's about everyone. His gaze drifted to the window, the silhouette of the obelisk tree standing tall against the night sky, a symbolic defiant pillar. Every day it stood, an unspoken accusation. And every day Mrs. Davenport's frustration festered, making her bolder, more careless in her retaliations, and inadvertently more transparent in her deceit. Their strategy began to take shape. They wouldn't go directly to the HOA board. Not yet. Mrs. Davenport had too much control over them. Instead, Mark planned to bypass the board and go directly to the residents. He wanted to expose the truth in a forum where Mrs. Davenport couldn't control the narrative. The annual Greenleaf Estates Homeowners Association meeting, usually a dull, uneventful affair, filled with polite applause and predictable updates. This year it was going to be an earthquake. He created a discreet but impactful presentation, a meticulously organized binder of evidence, anonymized where necessary, highlighting the questionable expenditures and lack of transparency. He planned to print copies, bound and organized, for every homeowner. He reasoned that once the facts were laid out, undeniable and irrefutable, the collective outrage of the community would be impossible for Mrs. Davenport to ignore or suppress. He wanted to shame her publicly with undeniable truths. He would fight fire with facts, bluster with transparency. But before the meeting, Mark made one final, crucial move. He consulted with Mr. Henderson, the retired lawyer on the HOA board, the one who had quietly spoken up during the tree meeting. Henderson was a man of integrity, known for his quiet disdain for Mrs. Davenport's more authoritarian tendencies. Mark presented his evidence to Mr. Henderson first, detailing the extent of the alleged financial impropriety. Henderson, initially skeptical, grew increasingly alarmed as Mark laid out the intricate web of questionable transactions. His face, usually placid, turned grim. "Mr. Jenkins," Henderson said, his voice low after reviewing the last document, "this is concerning, very concerning. If this is accurate and it appears to be meticulously documented, Mrs. Davenport and potentially others on the board could be facing serious legal repercussions. This isn't just an HOA dispute. This is potential fraud, malfeasance." Henderson confirmed what Mark had suspected: that the fines they had received, issued without properly documented board approval for the offenses, were illegal abuses of power. He quietly suggested that Mark also contact a specific state agency that investigated HOA malfeasance, providing him with a contact name. This conversation fortified Mark's resolve. He wasn't just speculating. He had the backing of a respected legal mind within the community. He knew the risk was immense. Mrs. Davenport, cornered and desperate, would likely lash out further. They had to be prepared for anything. The week leading up to the annual meeting was tense. The air in their home crackled with anticipation and a subtle undercurrent of dread. They continued to receive frivolous fines: a dirty mailbox, a weed out of bounds, a non-standard doormat. Each one was met with a quiet, steely resolve. They saw Mrs. Davenport's car passing their house more slowly, her gaze fixed on the obelisk tree, a silent, furious challenge. She had no idea her reign was about to crumble. She saw the tree as a symbol of their defiance, but she had yet to understand that it was merely the first domino in a much larger chain reaction. The night of the HOA meeting arrived. Mark, dressed in a simple but meticulously pressed shirt, carried his thick binder. Sarah walked beside him, her hand occasionally brushing his, offering silent support. As they entered the community hall, usually dimly lit and somewhat neglected, it was buzzing with an unusual energy. News of the ongoing feud had clearly piqued general interest. More residents were present than at any meeting in recent memory, a murmur of curiosity filling the room. Mrs. Davenport, already at the head table, looked out at the larger-than-usual crowd, a faint smirk on her lips. She probably assumed the increased attendance was a sign of heightened community engagement, perhaps even support for her firm stance against the disruptive Jenkins. She adjusted her blazer, her posture radiating confidence, a queen surveying her docile subjects. Her eyes, cool and triumphant, met Mark's for a fleeting moment. She smiled, a brittle, challenging smile. She thought she had them cornered, broken. She thought this meeting would be the final, public condemnation of their tree, their defiance, their very presence. She was ready to deliver a crushing blow. Mark, however, merely offered a small, polite nod in return. He placed his binder quietly on the table in front of him, next to his pen. The weighty thud was almost imperceptible in the bustling room, but to Sarah it sounded like a gavel falling, signaling the true start of the meeting. The obelisk tree outside, standing tall and proud beneath the moonlight, cast a long, slender shadow that stretched towards the lit building, a silent accomplice, ready to witness the quiet implosion of Mrs. Davenport's reign. The trap was set, and Mrs. Davenport, in her hubris, had walked right into it, completely unaware of the meticulously detailed, deeply personal and financially devastating data that was about to be unleashed. The air was thick with anticipation, not just for the tree, but for the entire community. The annual Greenleaf Estates Homeowners Association meeting began as predictably as ever. Mrs. Davenport, with her usual saccharine smile and ironclad demeanor, opened by welcoming everyone, her voice echoing slightly in the community hall. She reviewed the past year's achievements, rattled off upcoming maintenance schedules, and presented a bland budget overview, glossing over the more ambiguous line items with practiced ease. Her presentation was slick, confident, and utterly devoid of any genuine transparency. She moved through the agenda with ruthless efficiency, clearly eager to get to the new business section, the portion of the meeting where she undoubtedly planned to formally address and condemn the unapproved tree alteration at 142 Sycamore Lane. She wanted to draw a line in the sand to firmly reassert her authority. Mark and Sarah sat in the third row, Mark's formidable binder resting quietly on his lap. He observed Mrs. Davenport with a detached calm, a stillness that belied the storm brewing within him. He watched her every gesture, every calculated smile, every subtle dismissal of a resident's mumbled question. He was intimately familiar with her tactics by now. Her initial confidence was high, almost palpable. She truly believed she had absolute control. As the meeting approached the open forum for resident questions and concerns, Mrs. Davenport's eyes briefly flickered towards Mark, a flicker of professional challenge, mixed with a hint of personal animosity. She knew he would speak. She had prepared her counterarguments for his inevitable defense of his artistic tree. She probably even had a new, creatively interpreted, aesthetic clause ready to spring on him. "And now," Mrs. Davenport announced, her voice slightly louder, carrying a note of finality, "we open the floor to matters of new business and resident concerns. Please state your name and address for the record." A few minor issues were raised: a broken street lamp on Elm Drive, a pothole needing repair on Oak Avenue. Mrs. Davenport dispensed with them quickly, delegating tasks to junior board members, asserting her authority. Then Mark raised his hand. "Mr. Jenkins," Mrs. Davenport said, her smile tightening, 142 Sycamore Lane, "I believe you have a matter to discuss regarding your landscaping." A barely perceptible sneer colored her voice. She thought she had him cornered. She leaned back, poised for the debate, ready to unleash her carefully constructed argument against his tree. "Thank you, Mrs. Davenport," Mark said, his voice calm, clear, and projected deliberately for the entire room to hear. He rose slowly, deliberately, his presence commanding more attention than usual. "My concern tonight, while initially prompted by an issue concerning my property's landscaping, has broadened considerably. It now concerns the financial health and management of our entire Greenleaf Estates community." A ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. This was not what people expected, not the usual complaints about neighborhood aesthetics. Mrs. Davenport stiffened, her eyes narrowing. Her well-rehearsed counterarguments about tree height and aesthetic conformity suddenly seemed irrelevant. "I have spent the last few weeks compiling some rather disturbing information regarding the HOA's financial practices," Mark continued, his voice gaining momentum. He picked up his binder, the thick volume making a soft thud as he placed it on his chair. And with respect to the board, I believe this information warrants transparent discussion with the entire community. Mrs. Davenport's face went rigid. Mr. Jenkins, any financial inquiries should be formally submitted to the board for review, not sprung upon residents at an open meeting. Her voice was laced with a desperate urgency, a thinly veiled attempt to shut him down. With all due respect, Mrs. Davenport, Mark countered, his eyes locked on hers. I did attempt to engage the board previously on matters of due process and financial transparency. My requests were, shall we say, not adequately addressed. He paused, allowing the implication to sink in. Given the nature and extent of what I've uncovered, I believe every homeowner in Greenleaf Estates has a right to know immediately. He then, with measured movements, reached into his binder and pulled out a series of enlarged copies. The inflated invoice for the phantom sprinkler repair, the dubious security system upgrade bill, and several other receipts for services that seemed either non-existent or wildly overpriced. He held them up, one by one, for the room to see. For example, he said, his voice gaining power, this invoice here for $12,000 for emergency sprinkler system repair from last winter, dated December 15th. As many of you know, our community uses city-run water for our common areas, and there was no such emergency. Furthermore, this contractor, Greenleaf Solutions, appears to have been registered only 2 weeks before this invoice was paid, and its listed address is a residential home owned by a relative of one of our long-standing board members. He didn't mention Mrs. Davenport directly, but the veiled hint hung heavy in the air. A collective gasp went through the room. Whispers exploded. People turned, their faces a mixture of shock and anger, looking at each other, then at the board members. Mrs. Davenport's face, which had been pale with shock, now turned a mottled shade of red. She attempted to interrupt, her voice shrill with outrage. Mr. Jenkins, this is slander. These are confidential documents. These are public records, Mrs. Davenport, Mark calmly corrected her, holding up a printout of a state website, proving his claim quietly but definitively. And they are quite clearly bills paid by our HOA funds, which come directly from our homeowners' dues. He continued, systematically, laying out each piece of evidence with devastating clarity. He showed receipts for landscaping projects that were never completed, inexplicably high legal fees paid to a firm that had no visible presence in their community, and a series of smaller, consistent payments to a consulting firm, whose listed services were vaguely defined, and whose address traced back to a specific P.O. box. Each revelation hit the audience with increasing force, chipping away at the comfortable illusion of their well-managed community. The audience was no longer restless. They were riveted. Their murmurs had transformed into angry exclamations. Questions began to fly from the crowd. What about the new fence near the park? I thought we voted against that. Where did all the money for the summer picnic go? It always had a budget, but this year it was suddenly listed as privately funded. Mark then addressed the arbitrary fines. He presented his own notices, outlining the absurd infractions he had been cited for: the misplaced recycling bin, the non-existent gnomes. We have received numerous unverified fines, often without proper justification or a clear path for appeal, draining homeowners' funds unnecessarily. In my case, I was subjected to unprecedented scrutiny and fines amounting to over $1,000, seemingly as retaliation for an issue that I meticulously and legally resolved. He then projected pictures of his newly sculpted tree, glorious and proud, onto the screen beside him, a stark visual counterpoint to the ugliness of the financial deceit he was uncovering. Mrs. Davenport frantically pounded her gavel. Order, order, everyone. but her voice was drowned out by the rising crescendo of angry homeowner voices. The board members, usually subservient to Mrs. Davenport, now looked distinctly uncomfortable. Mr. Henderson, on the other hand, sat calmly, a grim satisfaction on his face. He nodded subtly to Mark, a silent acknowledgment of the meticulous work. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. The once docile assembly of homeowners, who had trusted their board to manage their collective funds responsibly, now felt personally betrayed. Their hard-earned money, their community, had been jeopardized by what appeared to be outright deception. The carefully constructed facade of Mrs. Davenport's control had crumbled, exposed by the cold, hard facts Mark had so methodically gathered. "I have already consulted with an attorney specializing in HOA malfeasance," Mark announced, his voice ringing with authority through the suddenly hushed hall. "And I have been advised that these actions, once fully verified, could constitute grounds for a full audit of HOA finances, and potentially even legal action against the individuals responsible. I am submitting this full report to the state regulatory body tomorrow morning." The statement hung in the air, a final, definitive blow. Mrs. Davenport's face was a mask of disbelief, then dawning horror. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking ashen. Her gavel lay forgotten on the table. She looked like a general whose entire army had suddenly deserted her. The Greenleaf Estates HOA, her personal kingdom, her meticulously ordered domain, was suddenly in chaos, its foundations exposed as rotten. And it all stemmed from a single, beautiful, rebellious tree, a tree she had so arrogantly tried to destroy. The quiet power of Mark's strategic retaliation had just unleashed a tidal wave, and Mrs. Davenport, standing on her crumbling pedestal, was about to be swept away. The meeting descended into an uproar, the collective fury of the homeowners now directed squarely at the board, particularly at Mrs. Davenport, who seemed to shrink under the weight of their collective gaze. The silence, when it finally fell, chillingly confirmed that her long reign in Greenleaf Estates was irrevocably, spectacularly over. The full, chaotic fallout of Mark's bombshell revelation hit Greenleaf Estates like a tropical storm. The annual meeting, which had devolved into an angry mob, didn't formally end. It simply disintegrated. Mrs. Davenport, stripped of her authority and exposed, fled the room, leaving behind a bewildered and furious board. The remaining homeowners spent hours huddled in groups, poring over the copies of Mark's binder, their whispers growing louder, angrier, as they absorbed the true extent of the financial irregularities. The air was thick with betrayal, punctuated by the rustle of papers and the indignant murmurs of people finally seeing the truth. The very next morning, the local newspaper, tipped off by a newly galvanized homeowner, ran a front-page story. Greenleaf Estates HOA embroiled in financial scandal. Residents demand accountability. The piece quoted several incensed residents and vaguely referenced a meticulously prepared report by an unnamed homeowner, protecting Mark's anonymity for the moment. The story, however, left no doubt about the severity of the allegations. The tree, once the focal point of the neighborhood's attention, was now a mere footnote, overshadowed by the very serious allegations of fiscal malfeasance. But it was still there, visible and clear, a living monument to the fight that started it all. The phone at the Jenkins house began to ring almost incessantly, not with more fines, but with calls from concerned and grateful neighbors. Some were apologetic, admitting they had believed Mrs. Davenport's carefully constructed narrative about Mark being difficult. Others offered support, eager to join the burgeoning movement for transparency. Many expressed shock and dismay, unable to reconcile the image of their pristine, orderly community with the messy reality of financial impropriety. They had trusted their board, blindly assumed competence and integrity, and now that trust was shattered. Mark, though exhausted, fielded every call, patiently explaining the next steps. He shared the contact information for the state regulatory body that investigated HOA issues, encouraging everyone to file individual complaints. He also began organizing an informal Residents for Transparency committee, a grassroots movement dedicated to demanding a full, independent audit of the HOA's finances. He was no longer just protecting his family. He was leading a community, a reluctant hero thrust into the spotlight. Mrs. Davenport, meanwhile, seemed to vanish. Her car, once a constant presence in her driveway, was rarely seen. Her immaculate lawn, usually tended with obsessive care, began to show faint signs of neglect. Her curtains remained drawn, a visible symbol of her retreat. The once formidable queen of Greenleaf Estates was now a recluse, her kingdom in revolt. The power she had so jealously guarded had evaporated overnight, replaced by suspicion and contempt. The board members, caught in the crossfire, were in panic mode. They publicly distanced themselves from Mrs. Davenport, issuing a weak statement promising a full review of past financial records and a commitment to restoring trust. It was too little, too late. The community's anger had been building for years, fueled by arbitrary rules and an authoritarian atmosphere. Mark's report had simply given it a legitimate target, a concrete outlet. Legal letters began to arrive, not for Mark, but for the HOA. The state regulatory body launched a formal investigation, prompted by the deluge of resident complaints and Mark's meticulously presented evidence. They demanded full access to all financial records, contracts, and meeting minutes, threatening severe penalties for noncompliance. Real consequences were now looming large over Mrs. Davenport and anyone else who had profited from or enabled the alleged misuse of funds. The obelisk tree, standing proudly in front of the Jenkins house, became an even more potent symbol. It was no longer just an anomaly. It was a beacon, a tangible representation of quiet defiance paving the way for wider justice. People would stop by the tree, not just to admire its unique shape, but to thank Mark and Sarah, to express their gratitude for their courage. Parents who had previously pulled their children away now encouraged them to play beneath its branches, a silent message of solidarity. Sarah watched these exchanges from her window, a warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't just about the money or the rules. It was about rebuilding community, about reclaiming their collective voice. Lily and Sam felt the shift too. Samantha's mom, the one who had banned her daughter from playing at their house, now called almost daily, profusely apologizing, begging for a playdate. Sam's friends, once subtly distant, were back to inviting him for bike rides. The social isolation, which had been one of Mrs. Davenport's most insidious weapons, began to dissipate, replaced by genuine connection and respect. Still, the battle was not entirely over. The independent audit requested by the newly empowered Residents Committee was a long, complex process. The state's investigation would require time and resources. There was a sense of relief, but also a growing understanding that systemic change was arduous work. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. One afternoon, as Sarah was watering her front garden, she saw a car pull up across the street. Mrs. Davenport's usually pristine mailbox, which just weeks ago carried official HOA notices to Mark, was now jammed with various flyers and petitions, almost overflowing. It was a visible sign of the community's new activism, a relentless tide she could no longer control. Mrs. Davenport, a thin shawl wrapped tightly around her, emerged from her front door. She looked smaller, frailer than Sarah remembered. Her hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was slightly disheveled. She walked slowly, hesitantly, towards her mailbox, eyes downcast. She pulled out a handful of the flyers, her fingers trembling slightly. As she turned to go back inside, her gaze, almost instinctually, lifted. It fell upon the obelisk tree. It stood there, tall and unyielding, a vibrant green against the backdrop of her muted house. Its unique, defiant shape perfectly framed her kitchen window, a constant, inescapable reminder of her downfall. She stared at it for a long moment, a complex mixture of anger, defeat, and perhaps even a glimmer of understanding playing across her features. Her carefully constructed world, built on control and rigid rules, had been shattered by something as elemental and untamed as a tree, shaped by a man who refused to be bent. She turned with a sigh, a figure of profound isolation, and slowly disappeared back into her darkened house, leaving the silent sentinel to stand its ground, a quiet, leafy monument to the power of one individual's unwavering resolve against an entire system. The community was changed forever, but the tree remained, a symbol of the quiet, unexpected power of creative resistance. The aftermath of Mrs. Davenport's swift and ignominious fall was a period of both upheaval and cautious optimism for Greenleaf Estates. The power vacuum at the HOA created a chaotic scramble, but it also offered an unprecedented opportunity for genuine change. Mark, now informally recognized as the community's reluctant leader, found himself constantly busy, attending ad hoc meetings, fielding calls from eager residents, and patiently explaining legal processes to bewildered neighbors. Sarah, though sometimes overwhelmed by the relentless pace, was proud of him. He carried the burden with humility and an unwavering commitment to justice, refusing to let the personal vindication overshadow the larger goal of community reform. The state investigation progressed with a methodical slowness typical of bureaucratic processes, but its presence was undeniable. Auditors moved into the HOA office, their quiet, focused scrutiny replacing the usual air of casual authority. Subpoenas were issued. Rumors flew through the neighborhood, often exaggerated but always centered on the alleged financial impropriety. Board members, facing increasing pressure and potential legal action, began resigning, one by one, leaving Mrs. Davenport utterly isolated and exposed. Her meticulously built edifice of power was crumbling brick by brick. The Residents for Transparency Committee, spearheaded by Mark, became a powerful force. They held regular open meetings, far more inclusive and informative than any past HOA gathering. Mark made sure to invite residents from all corners of the community, fostering a sense of unity that had been actively suppressed under Mrs. Davenport's reign. They discussed strategies for electing a new, truly representative board, drafted proposals for revised bylaws emphasizing accountability, and set up a fund for legal fees, just in case the state investigation required further private action. The atmosphere in Greenleaf Estates began to shift. Neighbors, once distant and polite, greeted each other with warmer smiles, a shared sense of purpose binding them together. Community events, previously sparsely attended, now saw enthusiastic turnouts as residents rediscovered a sense of belonging. The underlying tension that had permeated the air for years, a subtle fear of Mrs. Davenport's omnipresent scrutiny, slowly dissipated. Children played freely in the common areas, their laughter echoing through the revitalized spaces. The rigid uniformity that Mrs. Davenport so prized was beginning to yield to a more organic, vibrant community spirit. For Mark and Sarah, life began to normalize, albeit with a new sense of purpose. The arbitrary fines stopped. No more anonymous calls to code enforcement. Their mailbox, once a repository of threats, now held cards of thanks and invitations to neighborly barbecues. Lily and Sam's friendships flourished, unburdened by adult grievances. The quiet contentment they had sought, the sense of peace in their home, had finally returned. And the obelisk tree, standing tall and proud, continued to be a focal point, a silent symbol of their victory. Its unique form, once a source of controversy, was now embraced as a tribute to individuality and courage. Children often stopped by, sometimes just to stare up at its majestic, sculpted limbs, their imaginations sparked by its unusual beauty. Passers-by would occasionally take photos, no longer in bewilderment but with admiration. Then, about 3 months after the explosive HOA meeting, a significant development occurred. Mark received a formal letter from the state regulatory body. It was a thick envelope, official and imposing. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, Sarah watching anxiously over his shoulder. The letter confirmed their worst suspicions and their greatest hopes. It detailed the preliminary findings of the state audit: widespread financial mismanagement, undocumented expenditures, and clear conflicts of interest. It explicitly stated that several invoices, including the phantom sprinkler repair bill and the security system upgrade, were fraudulent. It also noted a pattern of illegal fines issued without proper board authorization. The sheer scale and systematic nature of the irregularities were laid bare in stark, official language. The letter announced that the state was moving forward with legal action against Mrs. Davenport and 2 other former board members, seeking restitution for the misappropriated funds and imposing significant civil penalties. Furthermore, it declared that the remaining, now significantly depleted, HOA board was deemed unfit to govern and recommended that the community be placed under temporary state oversight until new, legitimate elections could be held and new bylaws adopted. It was a complete capitulation, a full vindication of Mark's relentless pursuit of truth. Sarah let out a shaky breath of relief. "It's over," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "It's really over." Mark nodded, a wave of profound exhaustion washing over him, quickly followed by a deep sense of peace. "Almost," he corrected her gently. "Now we build it back better." The news spread through Greenleaf Estates like wildfire, amplified by follow-up articles in the local paper and frantic calls between neighbors. There was a collective sigh of relief, a communal shedding of anxiety. The residents had been vindicated. Mrs. Davenport's reign of terror had finally, unequivocally, ended. The next few months were dedicated to rebuilding. Under the temporary guidance of a state-appointed administrator, the residents worked tirelessly to draft new bylaws, emphasizing transparency, democratic processes, and clear lines of accountability. Mark was instrumental, using his newfound expertise to guide discussions and ensure that every resident's voice was heard. The community was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a functioning democracy, learning to govern itself justly. During this period, there was one final, poetic moment of closure regarding Mrs. Davenport. One sunny afternoon, a small moving truck pulled up to her house. Neighbors watched, quietly, from their windows as a few men methodically packed boxes and loaded furniture. Mrs. Davenport herself rarely emerged, only briefly seen directing the movers with a weary, defeated air. She was leaving Greenleaf Estates. Whether she had sold the house or it was part of a legal settlement, nobody knew for sure. But her departure was final. As the moving truck pulled away, turning the corner and disappearing from sight, silence descended upon Sycamore Lane. It was a quiet, almost reverent silence. Sarah, watching from her kitchen window, saw the setting sun cast a golden glow upon their magnificent oak. The obelisk tree, once a controversial symbol of defiant art, now stood as a quiet, proud monument to the enduring power of community, integrity, and the unexpected ways in which an individual's courage can ripple outward, changing an entire world. The long, weary battle was finally, truly, unequivocally won, and it had transformed not just one family but an entire neighborhood. The departure of Mrs. Davenport marked the end of an era in Greenleaf Estates, but it was far from the end of the story. It was the quiet, reflective period that followed her dramatic exit that truly defined the community's transformation. The initial burst of anger and indignation had settled into a steady hum of collective resolve. The residents, having tasted the sweet victory of truth and accountability, were determined not to let their guard down. They poured their energy into building a better future for their community. The election process for the new HOA board was meticulously planned and democratically executed. Instead of the usual uncontested appointments under Davenport's influence, there was a genuine contest. Several qualified residents stepped forward, campaigning on platforms of transparency, community engagement, and responsible fiscal management. Mark, urged by many, decided not to run for president himself. He knew his strength lay in detailed analysis and strategic planning, not in the administrative complexities of leadership. Plus, he and Sarah craved a return to some semblance of normal family life after months of high-stakes conflict. He did, however, agree to serve as a key advisor to the new board, leveraging his expertise in bylaws and financial oversight to ensure the mistakes of the past were not repeated. Mr. Henderson, the retired lawyer, was overwhelmingly elected as the new HOA president, bringing a much-needed sense of integrity and measured judgment to the position. Under Henderson's leadership, and with Mark's invaluable input, Greenleaf Estates underwent a series of profound changes. The HOA bylaws were entirely rewritten, with a strong emphasis on checks and balances. Financial records became fully transparent, accessible to any resident upon request, with quarterly reports published in a clear, easy-to-understand format. An independent professional auditing firm was hired, not just for the immediate aftermath, but to conduct annual audits, ensuring ongoing accountability. Contracts for community services were put out for competitive bidding, ending the suspicious pattern of favoritism. The whole process was designed not just to avoid fraud, but to foster trust. The community atmosphere continued to blossom. The Residents for Transparency Committee, initially formed in defiance, evolved into an active community engagement body, organizing regular social events, neighborhood cleanups, and even a quarterly community newsletter that featured local stories and resident spotlights. The stark, rule-bound landscape of Mrs. Davenport's Greenleaf Estates began to soften. Residents were encouraged to personalize their homes within reasonable, safety-conscious limits, fostering a sense of individuality that had long been suppressed. Subtle pops of color appeared on front doors, unique garden arrangements emerged, and a genuine sense of home, rather than mere property, began to flourish. The Central Park, once a sterile, unused space, became a vibrant hub of activity. New playground equipment was installed, chosen with input from children and parents. A community garden plot was established, cared for by enthusiastic volunteers. Even the infamous beige mailboxes, a symbol of Mrs. Davenport's obsessive uniformity, were quietly replaced. The new design was still consistent, but with a more modern, less institutional feel. The transformation was not just structural, it was cultural. For Mark and Sarah, this period was about healing and rediscovering their joys. The constant pressure was gone, replaced by a quiet satisfaction in having contributed to something truly positive. Their home, once a target, was now a sanctuary again. They spent more time with Lily and Sam, enjoying simple moments, family dinners without the shadow of impending fines, evenings playing board games, and long walks around a neighborhood that finally felt like theirs. The obelisk tree, their silent confederate in the initial confrontation, remained a proud and prominent feature of their front yard. It was no longer a symbol of controversy, but of resilience. Its unique shape, once considered an eyesore by Mrs. Davenport, was now admired for its artistry and individuality. Children used it as a landmark during their games, and neighbors often paused beneath its canopy, marveling at its enduring beauty. Mark kept it meticulously maintained, hiring the same arborist, who occasionally stopped by just to admire his handiwork and chat about the tree's continued health. The tree flourished, its roots having stabilized, its unusual form a testament to careful management and Mark's unwavering vision. It stood as a living reminder of the moment a single homeowner challenged an oppressive system, and won. One sunny Saturday afternoon, a new family, the Millers, were moving into Mrs. Davenport's former house directly across the street. Sarah watched from her porch as a young boy, about Lily's age, ran out onto the lawn, his eyes immediately drawn to the obelisk tree. He stood there for a long moment, head tilted back, gazing up at its sculpted branches. His mother, a cheerful woman named Emily who had already introduced herself, came out onto the porch. "That's quite a tree you have there," she remarked, smiling at Sarah. "It's truly magnificent. We've heard the stories." Sarah smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. "It's a very special tree," she said, her gaze lingering on the oak's distinctive form. "It has a lot of history." She felt a pang of nostalgia, remembering the fear, the frustration, the quiet dread, but also the fierce determination and ingenuity. All of it etched into the very fibers of that tree. Emily nodded. "It's a symbol, isn't it, of what one person can do when they stand up for what's right." Sarah's eyes met the tree, then her husband, who was helping Sam with his bike on the driveway. She saw the relief, the quiet pride in his posture. He wasn't a hero in the grand, dramatic sense, but a man who had simply refused to be bullied, who had used his intelligence and persistence to dismantle a corrupt system. And in doing so, he had, quite unexpectedly, forged a stronger, more benevolent community from the ashes of strife. The fight was over, the battle won, but the legacy of the obelisk tree and the transformed Greenleaf estates would continue to thrive for generations to come. The quiet, profound reverberations of that single act of defiant art would echo for years, shaping the very essence of their community. The years that followed solidified the new foundation of Greenleaf estates. The initial buzz of the scandal slowly faded, replaced by the everyday rhythms of community life, but the lessons learned and the changes implemented remained deeply embedded. The new HOA board under Mr. Henderson's steady guidance proved to be exactly what the community needed: transparent, fair, and genuinely invested in the well-being of all residents. Mark continued to serve as a valuable advisor, his deep understanding of the bylaws and financial integrity proving indispensable. His reputation as a quiet but formidable force for good was firmly established, earning him a profound respect throughout Greenleaf estates. The annual HOA meetings transformed from dreaded obligations into genuine opportunities for community engagement. Residents attended, not out of fear of fines or punitive measures, but because they felt their voices mattered. Open dialogues replaced autocratic pronouncements, and decisions were made collaboratively, reflecting the diverse needs and desires of the homeowners. The budget, once a murky pool of questionable expenditures, became a clearly itemized document, debated and approved with meticulous scrutiny from the residents themselves. Every line item, every dollar spent was accounted for, fostering a bedrock of trust that had been utterly absent before. The atmosphere around holidays in Greenleaf estates exemplified this transformation. Under Mrs. Davenport, decorations were strictly regulated, with specific dates for putting them up and taking them down, and even strict guidance on the types and colors of lights that were community approved. Now, creativity blossomed. Houses sparkled with unique light displays, some whimsical, some grand, all celebrated as expressions of individual spirit rather than sources of potential fines. Community-wide holiday events, like the annual Winter Festival and the Summer Block Party, grew in popularity, fostering genuine connections that transcended superficial neighborly pleasantries. Children made friends across streets, and adults formed carpools and study groups, creating a true sense of extended family. Lily and Sam, growing up in this reformed environment, benefited immensely. They saw firsthand the power of standing up for what's right, the importance of integrity, and the strength of community. They understood that rules were meant to serve people, not oppress them. Lily, with her artistic inclinations, often sketched the obelisk tree, inspired by its unique form and the story behind it. Sam, with his logical mind, would sometimes ask Mark about the money problems of the old HOA, absorbing the lessons of transparency and accountability. The saga of the tree and the HOA became an integral part of their family's narrative, a bedtime story turned life lesson. As Lily and Sam entered their teenage years, the obelisk tree continued to thrive. It had become a beloved landmark, known throughout the county for its distinctive shape and the remarkable story it represented. Local news channels occasionally revisited the Greenleaf Estates HOA comeback story, always featuring a shot of the Jenkins tree, a verdant symbol of triumph. Tourists, hearing the tales, would sometimes even drive by just to snap a photo of the famous tree, marveling at its artistry and the tenacity it represented. Its presence became a source of quiet pride for Mark and Sarah. Mark, now in his late 40s, found a new calling. Inspired by his own harrowing experience, he began consulting for other homeowner associations struggling with similar issues of transparency and governance. He offered his insights, warned about the pitfalls of unchecked power, and guided communities through the complex process of audits and bylaw revisions. He traveled occasionally, his expertise much sought after, always emphasizing that true community health lay in engaged residents and accountable leadership, not in rigid, arbitrary rules. He became a silent champion for homeowners' rights across the region. Sarah, too, found renewed purpose. She channeled her energy into local volunteer work, focusing particularly on initiatives that supported community welfare and children's education. She valued the strong bonds she had formed with her neighbors, a stark contrast to the isolation she had felt under Mrs. Davenport's regime. The experience had forged her, too, into a stronger, more resilient woman, deeply appreciative of the peace they had earned. The obelisk tree, meanwhile, continued its silent vigil. Its roots, once a source of civic dispute, now lay peacefully beneath the carefully repaired sidewalk, a testament to Mark's sensible mitigation. Its unique vertical form continued to grow slowly, gracefully, pushing its crown ever higher, a living sculpture in the suburban landscape. It stood as a permanent, undeniable reminder that beauty could emerge from conflict, and that even the most seemingly insignificant acts of resistance could spark profound and lasting change. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Mark and Sarah sat on their porch swing, a comfortable silence settling between them. They watched Lily, now a young woman, sitting beneath the tree, sketching in her notebook, her long hair falling over her shoulders. Sam, a budding engineer, was meticulously tightening spokes on his bike nearby, occasionally glancing up at the tree with a thoughtful expression. "Remember how terrified we were," Sarah mused, her voice soft, breaking the silence. "When that first letter came, the one about the tree, I thought we were doomed." Mark chuckled, a low, warm sound. "I know, it felt impossible, didn't it? An immovable object against an unstoppable force." He paused, looking at his family, then at the tree. "Turns out the force wasn't so unstoppable, and the object, well, the object became art. If this story moved you, share it. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories where justice, courage, and community collide. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment where the little guy stands tall. We'll see you in the next one.